This is a reading from The Little Flowers of St. Francis, an entirely new version with 20 additional chapters of the Christian classic of the ages. The Little Flowers of St. Francis was written not by St. Francis of Assisi, but by Brother Ugolini di Monte Santa Maria, who lived a century after the death of Francis. The work played an important part in the stormy early history of the Franciscan order. There was a heated controversy among the Franciscans over the true nature of the Franciscan way of life. This book was written to capture the true Franciscan spirit in the lives and thoughts of the founder and his followers. The original was written in Latin and called the Actus. The bulk of the Actus, in turn, was translated into Italian and became the famous Fioretti, or Little Flowers. The anonymous translator is an acknowledged master of Italian prose. This edition, alone among those available in English, translates the complete Actus, while also making use of the Fioretti whenever it would enhance the translation. It includes 19 chapters which have never before appeared in English, along with the following selections which over the years have come to be included with the original Little Flowers: the 5 considerations on the holy stigmata, the life of Brother Juniper, the life of Brother Giles, and the sayings of Brother Giles. Valuable extra features of this edition include an informative introduction giving new data about the author, the background of the book, and its historical value and significance, a short biography of St. Francis, 19 biographical sketches of the principal persons appearing in the book, a useful map, and the full critical apparatus of notes, appendices, references, and bibliography. The Little Flowers of St. Francis, first complete edition. Nihil obstat, Edward J. Montano, S.T.D., Censor Librorum. Imprimatur, Francis Cardinal Spellman, Archbishop of New York, April 2nd, 1958. Introduction. For the last 100 years, the Fioretti, or the Little Flowers of St. Francis, has been the most widely read book about the poverello, the little poor man of Assisi, who is the most popular figure in the history of Christianity after Jesus himself and the Blessed Virgin. But the true story of this great classic of world literature and of its author, as revealed by modern Franciscan research, has not yet been told. We shall therefore briefly survey, in the introduction, the life of St. Francis and the author of this book, the crucial role which it played in the turbulent early history of the Franciscan order, its historical value, its Latin and Italian versions with their various additional parts, its rise to worldwide popularity in modern times, the special features of this new edition, and lastly, the literary and spiritual qualities of the Fioretti. At the outset, it may be advisable to dispel a fairly common misconception. The Little Flowers was not written by St. Francis himself, but by an Italian Franciscan who lived 100 years after the saint died, St. Francis of Assisi. This extraordinary man, whom all the world loves and honors as a faithful mirror of Christ, began life as a gay playboy. He was born in Assisi in central Italy in 1182, the son of a wealthy, middle-class linen merchant, Pietro di Bernardone. Francis was a gentle, likable, and fun-loving boy. He learned to read and write Latin at St. George's Church School, and his father, who often traded in France, taught him some French. In his youth, he was deeply influenced by the high ethical ideals of medieval chivalry, as reflected in the great epic poems which he heard the troubadours sing: selfless devotion to a lofty goal, loyalty to a liege lord, considerate courtesy towards all persons, and generous compassion for the poor and the weak. Young Francis dreamed of winning fame and glory as a valiant knight in armor. But his military career was brief and disappointing. Captured during a battle between Assisi and Perugia, he spent a frustrating year as a cheerful and popular prisoner of war. After a period of illness, he set out to fight for the Pope, but a revelation which he received in nearby Spoleto urged him to serve the Lord rather than man. So he went home and began to turn to Christ in solitary prayer. At this time, he was also granted an unforgettable vision of Jesus suffering his passion on the cross. Characteristically, Francis then began to help poor priests and the needy, and even to associate with paupers. During a pilgrimage to St. Peter's tomb in Rome, he spent a day dressed as a beggar. Later, near Assisi, he embraced the man who had leprosy. While he was praying fervently for divine guidance in the old chapel of San Damiano, Christ in the crucifix said to him, "Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you see, is falling into ruins." Soon, his greedy father, exasperated by his son's extravagant generosity and strange vocation, summoned him before the bishop's court in order to recover the money he had spent. But Francis stripped himself naked to symbolize his complete renunciation of the world for God. This climax of his conversion, which occurred in 1206, when he was about 25, marked the beginning of his 20 years of knightly service to his true liege lord, Christ the King. Dressed in a hermit's robe, he spent over 2 years nursing victims of leprosy and repairing 3 small churches near Assisi, San Damiano, San Pietro, and the Portiuncula, or St. Mary of the Angels. There, on February 24th, 1209, the Holy Spirit revealed to him in the Gospel of the Mass, Matthew chapter 10, verses 9, ff, the specific way of life to which God was calling him. He then began to preach brief, informal sermons in Assisi. Within a few weeks, 3 companions, Bernard, Peter Catani, and Giles, joined him. Soon they set out on a first mission journey, Francis and Giles going to the marches of Ancona, while the other 2 took another direction. After 8 more volunteers had taken up the new life in 1210, they wrote a simple rule based on the Gospels and traveled to Rome, where Pope Innocent III gave them his verbal approval. Probably at this time, Francis was ordained a deacon. Out of humility, he never became a priest. On returning to Assisi, the 12 friars minor lived for a while in extreme destitution in a shed at Rivo Torto, and then, as their numbers increased, they moved to the Portiuncula, which was given to them by the Benedictines of Mount Subasio. In that chapel, in 1212, Francis gave the religious habit to an aristocratic 18-year-old girl of Assisi named Clare, who thereby became the foundress of the Second Order of Cloistered Nuns. St. Francis was the first founder of an order to include in its rule a chapter dealing with foreign missions. In 1212, and again a year later, he tried in vain to reach the Moslems in North Africa and Spain, with the hope of preaching to them and of dying as a martyr. While attending the Lateran Council in Rome in 1215, he formed a lasting friendship with St. Dominic. The following year, he obtained from Pope Honorius III the Portiuncula indulgence. In 1217, when the General Chapter organized provinces and missions in European countries and the Holy Land, he volunteered to go to France. But Cardinal Hugolin, later Pope Gregory IX, persuaded him to remain in Italy, where he preached throughout 1218. The next year, however, he left 2 vicars to govern the order and sailed to join the Crusaders at the siege of Damietta in Egypt. There, at the risk of his life, he preached to the Sultan. The saints returned to Italy in 1220, suffering from malaria and glaucoma, marked the beginning of the great spiritual trial in his life when, according to his first biographer, he complained that some of his friars were piercing me with a hard sword and stabbing it into my heart all day. Within a few months, he obtained from the Holy See the appointment of Cardinal Hugolin as protector of the order, and then he proceeded to resign as its effective administrator, naming in his place Peter Catani, after the latter's death in 1221. The famous brother Elias. Next, he wrote the long, eloquent rule of 1221, but found that he must revise and rewrite it twice before it was formally approved in 1223. In order to understand the nature of this great trial, this dark night of the spirit, which the Poverello suffered for over 2 years, we must have a clear idea of the novel form of the religious life which he introduced into the traditional mold of monastic chastity, poverty, and obedience. In his mind, the basic conception of the order of friars minor was quite simple. It was the literal, deliberate imitation of the way of life of Christ and his apostles, as described in the Gospels. In practical application, this meant an itinerant life divided almost equally between prayer and preaching, and supported by work, if possible manual, or by begging, with the greatest stress laid on voluntary self-denial and renunciation of property, all for the single purpose of enabling oneself and inducing others to live a life of ever closer union with Christ in his church. Now, an objective study of early Franciscan documents definitely reveals that some friars, represented by the two vicars of 1219 and later by Brother Elias, failed to grasp or accept this ideal. In its stead, they advocated a combination of traditional monastic asceticism and conventual life with a more active and especially a more intellectual apostolate. As a result, St. Francis found an influential group within the order trying to modify the way of life which he was convinced that God had inspired him to adopt. In the end, while retaining as much of his original idea as he could, he humbly submitted to the prudent mediation and guidance of his friend, Cardinal Hugelin, who persuaded him that some degree of adaptation was essential so that the order might most effectively repair the Church. By contributing a full measure of cooperation to the educational and missionary apostolates which were so sorely needed at that time. With the Cardinal, he also instituted the lay Third Order in 1221. The Poverello regained his peace of soul when, in a crucial revelation, he received divine assurance that Christ himself would always remain the principal head of the order, and that all friars who sincerely wished to follow their founder would do so. On emerging from this dark night, the saint experienced the mystical joy of holding in his arms the babe of Bethlehem before the realistic crib which he prepared at Greccio on Christmas Eve, 1223. Then at last he was ready for the final seal, Dante, the transforming union that God bestowed on him by imprinting the 5 holy stigmata on his body on Mount Alverna in September 1224. After another 2 years of increasingly painful illness, eye, stomach, liver, and spleen sickness with dropsy, during which he composed the beautiful Canticle of Brother Sun and wrote an inspiring testament, St. Francis died peacefully at his beloved Portiuncula on October the 3rd, 1226. His friend, Pope Gregory IX, canonized him 2 years later. Such, in brief, was the life of the world's greatest follower of Christ. For one of the most vivid profiles of this personality which has ever been written, we must turn to the Fioretti.